Hey everyone, this is Dan at SPE Motorsport. On this week's product spotlight, we're going to be going over our Generation 2 disaster prevention kit for the 11 to current Powerstroke. All right, before we go over everything on the table and talk about all the nitty-gritty and the design aspects of the new Generation 2 kit, we're going to talk about the reason for updating our Generation 1 kit. So we've had a lot of customer feedback over the years and a lot of competitor feedback. We'll kind of touch on some of the things that were positive and some of the things that were actually negative and go over what drove us to do this. So some of the customer feedback on our original kit, threaded connections. So we did have some NPT fittings, some fittings that needed thread sealer, and we had AN lines, which all worked perfectly fine, but you still have that during assembly. So it adds time to assembling it. It has failure points because you have multiple connections. So we wanted to simplify that. We had some of the quick connect fittings. We had C washers. People didn't like that because they had to put the washer on, then put a bolt in. It added a little bit of complexity. The return filter that we had on the system, we had to twist one of the return fittings in the factory line to put it on to make it work. So that was something that people didn't like. So some of the competitor stuff, same thing. We had obviously the threaded fittings was one of the complaints. Everybody's worried about the passages inside the M-prop adapter. So the M-prop adapter is what sits on top of the CP4, and it's the passage where we're adding or we're moving the fuel flow to the M-prop. If that passage is too small, it is a restriction on the pump itself. So that supply line to the pump is going to be restricted by the fitting that feeds the actual M-prop valve. So on the new kit, that's all been addressed. We'll go over that here in a couple seconds. The screen on the return filter, the filtration aspect of it, we changed that. We changed a little bit of the way it functions and took care of some of those issues. So before I dive into this once again, we wanted to make sure we touched on some of the problems, and we also want to touch on the positives of the DPK in general, the aspects of it. So if anybody's new to these trucks, you're probably asking that question of, well, why do I need a disaster prevention kit? What's the point of this product? Once you kind of look at the CP4 and understand how it functions, you'll understand why the disaster prevention kit kind of comes into play. So these pumps, the way they're designed, is you have fuel feeding into the pump, into the crankcase of it. And then after it fills up the crankcase full of fuel, the crankcase and the pump, there's a passage that comes up and out of the pump that feeds this metering valve, which is called an M-prop or volume control valve, depending on if it's Dodge or Ford or Duramax, whatever. So when that fuel feed comes up from the crankcase, it hits this valve, and then it comes out from the valve and is distributed to the heads that then create your high pressure fuel. The problem is if something happens in the crankcase of the CP4, whether it eats a bearing, a roller, whatever, contamination gets down in there, that immediately is fed to this valve, then out to the heads. So whenever that happens, you have all that trash that's building up in there, it gets pumped out to your injectors. So the whole theory behind the disaster prevention kit is to eliminate that. So when I say eliminate that, it's when you feed the fuel to the pump, now you're feeding it in two different ways. You're retaining the factory feed to the pump to lubricate the crankcase, and then we're also adding an additional feed to just the valve off of the filter. So you have clean fuel flow coming down to the metering valve via this adapter block, which then plugs off where the crankcase fuel would feed it. So now the factory line is only lubricating the crankcase. The additional feed that we're adding is actually where your fuel flow is going to the high pressure heads. So you have nice clean fuel coming out of the filter now that isn't going to be contaminated by a pump failure, going through the metering valve out to the pump heads, then to the injectors. So in other words, what you're achieving by that is if the pump does eat itself or you have a bunch of contaminated fuel in the crankcase of the pump, it can't physically get to the high pressure side of the heads on the pump to go out to the injectors. if the pump fails, you're eliminating having to replace all the injectors with it. So if you don't have to replace all the injectors, you save yourself a lot of money. Injectors are not cheap. They vary depending on where you're getting them, but either way, injectors are not inexpensive. So if you only have to replace the pump itself and you don't have to replace the injectors that are in the truck, you're saving yourself a lot of headache and a lot of money. You got labor time you're saving, and you also have the cost of the parts itself. After that crankcase is destroyed, or the bottom end of this pump is destroyed, there is a place for that fuel to go. So in our Generation 1 kit, we were the first on the market to do a return filter. So our return filter setup that we originally did, the whole point of it is once you have all that trash built up in here, you have a regulator system built into this pump, or a passage that returns to the tank. So it can still go back into the tank and eventually be picked up by your lift pump and pumped back through, and then you're relying on the filter then to strain it all. So what we're doing is, as the trash and everything that's in this pump is built up, when it comes out the return line, we're once again filtering it to try to pull the contaminants out of the lines going back to the tank. Now, one of the reasons that we came up with it in our Generation 1 kit is everything on the market up to that point, even in a contamination kit Ford would sell, or some aftermarket companies sell, the contamination kits, or the disaster kits they call it, which come with a pump, injectors, lines, everything to repair a fuel system failure, none of those systems come with a fuel cooler. So on the return side is actually your fuel cooler on your truck. So everyone's replacing all the stuff up on the engine, lines, pumps, injectors. Nobody would touch the fuel cooler. So inside the fuel cooler, you have a radiator, essentially a radiator fin design that's going to catch contaminants and catch all kind of debris and stuff. So you have all that sitting on the frame rail after you replace everything. Now that gets pumped back to the tank over time, and you're making your filters work extra hard and hoping that they catch everything. So once again, you still have your filters, and you still have all that stuff in a factory form helping eliminate those contaminants, but you also have to work them harder and rely on them. So we figured if we put a screen that could be cleaned in the return filter system that we came up with, it's a filter that's reusable and not disposable. So it's not a maintenance item. It's something that you can take out and literally clean it off if you have a failure, put it back in. It's not a maintenance item. A lot of our competitors and stuff on the market that came out with the return filter after we did, they have a maintenance item now, because you have a cellulose filter in the return side of that system, and cellulose is essentially paper, and if there's any kind of moisture in the fuel or anything, over time that filter is going to need to be changed, just as a filter would on a regular pickup in any scenario. Even if you don't have a failure, even if you're not running bad fuel, you always maintenance those filters. So now you just added a cost. So we don't want to add a cost to that system. We want that system to be something where you can just check it, look at it. It's something simple that you can look at and say, all right, you know, I'm getting material in this filter. Now I need to either pay attention, or I need to actually look at the health of my pump. It's just something as a fail-safe, not a maintenance item. So now that we've kind of gone over the way that the pumps work and the way the DPK works, hopefully you have an understanding of the system in general. So once again, just a touch on it. Fuel comes into the pump. We're leaving the fuel through the factory line that feeds it. We're leaving that in the crankcase of the pump as a lubricant. We're adding another feed line off of the filter, teed in, to feed the M-prop valve, which then feeds the pump heads. So anything that fails inside the pump is now contained just to the pump and just to the return system on the truck. So now that you kind of have an understanding and an overview of that, we're going to kind of go into what we did to update our Generation 1 kit. So as far as the whole mindset of doing this kit, we looked at it as if though we were Ford. We were looking at it from a manufacturer standpoint. We wanted to take the approach of, if the factory had to do this system and fix the problem, that they kind of created to begin with, how would they go about doing it? How would that system be laid out? What products would they use? What fittings, what manufacturing process would they use? So the first thing we wanted to do was eliminate all the NPT connections, all the fittings that were added sealing points or connection points or failure points, in our opinion. We made all of the connections on the whole system all O-ringed. If you look here, you can kind of see we have 3 hard lines now going down to the pump. You have your factory feed, you have your factory return, and then you have our new feed line that comes down and O-rings into the M-prop adapter. So now the M-prop is moved just as it was before, but instead of having fittings in it or even a piece of rubber hose with a PEX clamp on it, we have a hard line running down now with O-rings. The way that it O-rings in uses the factory bolt to actually hold it down. So you'll actually see on this hard line, you'll be able to see that it's double O-ringed. It pops right into the end prop adapter. And then it uses the factory bolt for the factory lines. So they're essentially going right on top of each other. So you don't even have to add a piece of hardware to make it work. You're using the factory bolt as the manufacturer would do it if they were to do so. As we stated earlier about the passage and the feed going to the M-prop is a big deal, because if it's too small or the line's too small, you could have rail pressure issues, you could have pressure drop across the feed system to the pump. So one of the things that we took into account was obviously making the passage large enough, but we made it large enough to the point that it's actually the same diameter as the factory feed line. So even the hard line coming down to feed the M-prop adapter and the M-prop valve is exactly the same size as the factory feed line. So the idea of the hard line that feeds the pump from the factory and the add-on line is exactly the same. So inside of the M-prop adapter, we carried that through. So the passage to feed the M-prop is also the same size as the internal diameter of the line. So moving up from the pump, obviously we have the M-prop adapter, we have the new hard line. Now we have 3 lines up here that we have to deal with. So instead of just adding zip ties or something along those lines, we actually injection molded a new 3-line clamp. So now you have a factory style clamp that snaps over all 3 hard lines, just as the factory would do. Moving up, you'll see the actual lines to connect all of this are all factory style nylon push-on lines. So they're all quick connect. It's all nylon molded, just as the factory line is. As you can see, there's a T here that we made for this that tees a line in that feeds that 3rd hard line that runs down to the M-prop. The return filter assembly, we completely redesigned. So instead of having a flat body with just a flat screen in it, we wanted the customer to be able to see the actual fuel flow and if there's contaminants in it without breaking the system open. That was something we really wanted to do for the customer. You can just look through it with a flashlight and you'll be able to actually see the physical contaminants. The one downside that we had with the screen is if you kept driving the truck, at some point something in that system, even if it's a maintenance item style filter or a screen, once that plugs up, you're gonna have issues. You have pressure buildup, you have problems on the return side of the fuel system. So what we wanted to do was eliminate that. So what was the best way to allow the customer to not only see contaminants if they're maintaining the vehicle or looking at it, but also if you're driving it? How do you know if your pump fails? Everything else on the market never lets you know. There's no way to know unless the truck physically starts to run bad. You know, we had a competitor drive a vehicle that was intentionally hurt and tried to prove the point that they were catching all the contaminants before it went back to the tank. Well, that's great, but you're also possibly hurting other things in that process. You know, the longer you drive it with a failed pump, the more possibilities you have in hurting something else, or maybe something actually, if the pump splits, you could dump fuel everywhere, cause a fire. It's not a good idea. If you add a bunch of load, if the pump fails, it's going to add a lot of load to the timing system, and then the crank gear can technically slip on the crank. If that happens, your valves are out of time, everything's out of time, and you can have valves hitting pistons. You could literally have engine failure because of a pump failure. What we wanted to do was create a way that the customer would actually know if contamination was happening while they're driving the truck. As the return fuel comes out of this pump and goes back to our filter assembly, we actually have what we call a contamination sensor, which is very simple. It's a pressure style sensor, but what it does is it monitors pressure drop. So if our filter becomes clogged, our screen becomes clogged, we created a setup to where we're connecting a wiring harness to the pressure sensor that then taps into the factory fuel pressure switch on the truck. We have 2011 to 2014, and then we have 15 to 19, and then 20 plus. All the harnesses are designed specifically for the model. So what that does is it jumpers the switch in between the fuel pressure switch, and what that does is, if this pressure switch is tripped because there's pressure drop and the screen is clogged, it immediately trips the wires together, essentially creating a short in the system as the factory switch would, which then will tell you in the dash, you'll either get check engine, depending on the model year, you'll get different feedback from the truck, whether it be a check engine light, a fuel system error, fuel pressure low, or large fuel leak detected. There's a couple different things that Ford has done over the model years, but either way, it will tell you that you have an issue. So that was a major thing for us, because no one else has done that to this point, and we want the customer to know as soon as possible so that you have the best chance in saving your injectors and saving that labor cost and saving that. The other thing that we did with the fuel filter assembly, other than the lid and the contamination sensor, is we routed the return connector for the factory system. We routed it in a way that you don't have to modify any of the fuel lines on the truck. There's no added lines in the manner of like rubber fuel lines, PEX clamps, quick connect stuff that isn't factory. All that stuff is eliminated. So on the return line, all you do is you're going to pop the factory return line off of the rail right here that this is sitting on. You're going to pop that off. You're going to slide, this is O-ringed, it slides right down over top of it. There's a bracket that goes on the side of this, and you'll be able to see that here on the valve cover. There's a bracket that goes on the side of this, and it actually uses the factory bolt for the factory return hard line. So all you do is remove that bolt, slide this over, put the bolt back in, and it's on. There's no quick connects, there's no nothing. It's just an O-ring connection. And then the factory fuel line that you removed with a 90 or 45 on it, you're going to take it off and you're going to snap it right next to it. So as you can see, that's not, the quick connect isn't very far apart from where the port is. So you're basically coming off and going over an inch and a half, an inch. Everything's very close, self-contained. It's a very simple setup, but we're achieving exactly what we want to achieve. 20 micron screen, just as we did before. We have an anti-crush spring inside of the screen. So if the pressure does build up and you're driving it and it does, you're alerted in the dash, but you need to get off and do an exit, you don't have to worry about the screen imploding and then letting everything go back to the tank. That's all solved. The basic design of the return filter setup, the exo filter, is one of the driving things as far as covering a lot of the issues we had from customers and competitors. So that was one of the driving things that helped us get this design the way we had it. Without that information and without that feedback and without us listening, a lot of this may not even have came to the market. So we know that, and we want our customers to know that we're standing behind the product and we're listening and always pushing forward and driving innovation so that we always have the best possible thing we can have on the market. The other nice thing about this kit is, being that there aren't fittings and there aren't sealant and things of that nature, the installation time is reduced drastically. So yeah, that covers most of the key points of this kit. We're pretty happy with how everything has turned out. We want to make sure that any of the customers with any questions can reach out to us. You know, we want to make sure that you comment or reach out to us on Facebook, Instagram, whatever it may be. Call in. If you have any questions on the functionality of the system or the installation of the system, we'd be more than happy to tell you and give you a hand with that. If there's anything else that you need to know, reach out and we'll do the best we can to help you out. And we'll catch you on the next one.